In all of the vast history of the Sith, few stories are quietly as tragic as that of Darth Traya. Before she ever donned the title of Dark Lord, she was Kreia, a wise and respected Jedi historian whose only crime was teaching her students to question, to search deeper, and to truly understand the Force in all of its complexities. Among her students was Revan, a prodigy whose hunger for knowledge mirrored her own, and the Jedi Council chose paralysis over action. It was Revan who finally stepped forward, determined to save the Republic himself. But what began as fierce defiance became catastrophe. Revan fell to the dark side, and in the aftermath, the Jedi Council needed someone to blame. It was Kreia who they turned on. They exiled her, claiming it was her teachings that had unleashed the greatest threat the galaxy had ever seen. And in that moment, the seeds of her lifelong doubt, her suspicion that the Force itself was an indifferent manipulator, took root and grew into an obsession. Cast out by the Jedi and betrayed by the very order that she had served, she saw answers where no sane mind would ever look, on the dead world of Malachor 5. Here she would encounter the dark side not as an abstract concept, but as a palpable will, embodying beings who had completely surrendered to it. In them, she saw everything that she feared, that sentient life was nothing more than a pawn to a cosmic power, without morality or without mercy. This is the story of Darth Traya, the teacher condemned for her students' sins, the philosopher who dared to challenge the will of the Force itself, and the tragic figure whose life became a testament to betrayal, sorrow, and the dangerous pursuit of forbidden truth. From the very beginning, Kreia was never like the other Jedi. While her peers studied the Force as a means to serve destiny, she quietly wondered whether destiny itself was a prison. Born with an uncommon sensitivity to the currents of the Force, Kreia became a historian and a philosopher, driven not by ambition or conquest, but by a simple, unquenchable curiosity. She believed knowledge was the highest virtue, that understanding all sides of the Force was the only true path to wisdom. It was this devotion to understanding, not power, that led her to train some of the most brilliant minds the Order would ever produce. A student whose questions mirrored her own, and whose hunger for purpose would one day shape the galaxy. When the Mandalorian Wars erupted, Kreia watched in silent frustration as the Jedi Council refused to act, paralyzed by their faith and destiny. To Kreia, the cost of inaction was measured in the lives of worlds. Yet, by all of her doubts, she never forced her students down any path. She simply taught them to question, to think beyond the rigid dogma of the Jedi Order. But while Revan returned from the war as a Sith Lord, the Jedi Council turned their fear and shame into accusation. Kreia was branded the architect of his fall, the corrupter who had poisoned a generation with dangerous ideas. In truth, Kreia had only ever tried to help her students find their own way. Exiled and alone, Kreia began to wonder if her lifelong suspicion had been right, that the Force was no benevolent guide, but an indifferent force, shaping destinies without care for those who suffered in its currents. While the Jedi clung to the belief that the will of the Force was inherently good, Kreia could no longer accept that the tragedies of her life were necessary, or even meaningful. She asked herself a question no Jedi dared. What if destiny is simply another kind of slavery? In the end, it was this quiet defiance, not malice, that set her on a path to Malachor 5. There she would confront the darkest truths that she could find, and would eventually become Darth Traya, the teacher who sought to tear down the Force itself. But before this life as a Sith Lord, Kreia was simply a woman who refused to surrender her mind to fate, and whose greatest sin was asking whether destiny was ever truly worth following. But it wasn't merely exile that kindled her rage, it was the hypocrisy that defined it. For decades, the Jedi had encouraged her to search the archives tirelessly, to dig into forgotten histories and uncover secrets that they themselves were too timid to face. Whenever she brought them new discoveries, they would praise her. They called her a scholar, a visionary, and yet the moment she dared to question whether their teachings were truly complete, whether even the Jedi were sometimes blind, they instantly branded her a heretic. All that she had devoted her life to, her rank, her identity, her purpose, was ripped away in an instant. They didn't exile her from the Jedi, they exiled her from everything that she had ever been. In their eyes, she was no longer Kreia the respectable historian. She was nothing but a dangerous voice, one better cast into silence than allowed to challenge the comfort of their dogma. It was in that emptiness, in the quiet after her life had been burned to ash, that Kreia made her fateful decision. If the Jedi would deny her the knowledge that she sought, if they would call her dangerous simply for thinking, then she would embrace everything that they had forbidden. She would not shy away from the dark. She would master it, not as a slave, but as an equal. She believed that by understanding the darkness as fully as she had once understood the light, she could finally see the Force without illusions, without grandeur. But the deeper she went into the secrets of the dark side, the more Kreia realized that the Jedi had never been her true enemies at all. They were only pieces on the board, pawns, just like the Sith. Her real jailer had always been the Force itself. It was the Force that had guided her students into war, that had elevated Revan to a hero and then a monster, that had placed her on a path only to break her. It was the Force that authored every triumph, every tragedy, indifferent to the suffering that it caused. And so she came to believe that her destiny was not just to defy the Sith or the Jedi, it was to liberate the galaxy from the tyranny of destiny itself. But to do that, to challenge the Force, she would have to claim the very power that she despised. She would have to wield the dark side as a weapon, not merely to conquer others, but to free them. In that conviction, she ceased to be Kreia. She became Darth Traya, the betrayer of all creeds, and the herald of a final war against the Force itself. Driven by the conviction that only absolute knowledge could free her from the Force's manipulations, Kreia set her course for a world that the Jedi had long sealed away in fear. Malachor 5. This place was no ordinary graveyard. It was the epicenter of Revan's greatest crime, the site of a superweapon that had torn a wound in the Force, one so deep that it bled into every living thing that came near it. When she first set foot on the shattered surface, she felt it immediately, a deafening silence beneath all sound, the echo of countless lives extinguished in an instant. It wasn't just a battlefield. Malachor 5 was a scar on reality, and it was within that darkness that Kreia sensed another figure. Two presences, twisted, hungry, and impossibly strong, Sion and Nihilus, Dark Lords of the Sith. To anyone else, this would have been their end. Sion was death made flesh, a creature who refused to die no matter how many times he was broken. Nihilus was worse, a wound in the Force given consciousness, a void that devoured entire worlds. But Kreia did not come to Malachor as a conqueror. She arrived as a student. She opened herself up to the dark side, listening to its secrets, its mysteries. In the catacombs of the Traya Academy, she unearthed knowledge the Jedi had buried for millennia. She studied the rituals that gave Nihilus his insatiable hunger, and the dark arts that bound Sion's will to his shattered body. She learned the ways of the Sith not to surrender herself, but to understand, to master every doctrine, every heresy, every forbidden truth. And in time, she saw that her will was stronger than theirs. Through cunning and hindsight, Kreia did what no Sith before had ever achieved. She dominated both Sion and Nihilus, binding them to her purpose. She became their master not by brute force, but through the clarity of her vision. Where they were slaves to their hunger and their hatred, she was something far more dangerous. A mind that refused to be broken. A philosopher who would wield the dark side not for conquest, but to destroy the Force's hold over all of life. Yet, even as Kreia mastered the darkest secrets Malachor had to offer, she found no satisfaction in any of them. If anything, her study of the Sith only confirmed her most dreadful suspicion, that the dark side was an infection as much as it was a power. To wield it was to surrender something essential, to hollow out the self in exchange for the illusion of strength. She saw it mostly in the wretched forms of her apprentices. Sion, who was bound by his broken flesh together with sheer hatred, was a creature in perpetual agony. Every moment he continued to exist was a testament to how complete the dark side had consumed a person. And Darth Nihilus, the void in human shape, was perhaps the ultimate expression of the dark side's hunger. He had become nothing but appetite, stripped of name, stripped of memory, stripped of soul. In quiet moments, Kreia sometimes felt a flicker of pity for them. She understood, perhaps better than anyone alive, that their monstrosity was not simply a choice, but the final consequence of surrendering to the dark. But whatever compassion she may have held was buried beneath contempt. For all their terrible power, they were still slaves. Slaves to their impulses, slaves to the Force. Pawns on the same board she had spent her life trying to escape. It was then that Kreia began to see the dark side not as an answer to the Jedi's blindness, but as another prison. One even crueler than the light. While the Jedi clung to the delusion of moral certainty, the Sith clung to suffering and the worship of their own pain. The Force corrupted both paths, elevating those most willing to sacrifice everything that made them human, And so in the end, Kreia's hatred grew to encompass not only the Jedi, but the dark side itself. She realized that every philosophy, every doctrine of control, compassion, conquest, or peace was just another mask for the Force's endless cycle of manipulation. To her, there was only one escape left. She would have to use the darkness, but never surrender to it, because if she did, she would become another monster, another pawn in a game that she no longer believed in. And so Kreia did what no Sith before her had ever dared. She used the dark side not because she believed in it, but because she had concluded it was simply another mask that the Force wore, a mask she had to master, so that she could better hope to rip it away. She looked at Darth Sion and Darth Nihilus and saw not just monsters, but victims. Victims of the same cosmic cruelty she had known her entire life. They were beings who had tried to take control of their fate, only to become more enslaved than anyone. In that way, she almost pitied them. But her pity was always laced with contempt, because even in their horror, they still served the Force. They were examples of what the Force did to those who reached for too much power. Cautionary tales masquerading as conquerors, and in her eyes, their endless hunger and suffering proved a truth no Jedi or Sith could ever admit. The Force used everyone, in every era, without purpose and without mercy. This was the revelation that set Kreia apart from every teacher and tyrant that came before her. Where the Jedi called the Force balance and the Sith called it strength, she saw only manipulation. To Kreia, it was neither a god nor a guide. It was a cold, indifferent will that elevated heroes and monsters alike, only to then cast them down, feeding on the endless cycle of hope and then despair. And that is why she believed her crusade was necessary, not simply to punish the Jedi for their hypocrisy or the Sith for their arrogance, but rather to free every living being from the invisible chains that bound them to a destiny that no one had ever chosen. She would become the instrument of that liberation, even if it meant becoming the greatest heretic the galaxy had ever known. Because in Kreia's mind, there was one more terrifying truth that no prophecy could ever erase, no victory could ever conceal. The Force itself was the villain in all things. But anyway, my friends, I hope you enjoyed this look and dive into the philosophy and mindset of Darth Traya and Kreia, certainly one of the most tragic Sith in all of Star Wars lore. She is one of the most compelling figures in the entire galaxy because she defies every expectation of what a Force user should be. She is neither a selfless Jedi nor a power-hungry Sith Lord, but something altogether more complex. A woman who has seen the failings of both paths and refused to accept either. Her life is defined by exile, betrayal, and the relentless search for meaning beyond dogma. This unyielding skepticism makes her feel more human and more tragic than almost any other character in the mythos. Her philosophy that the Force itself is an oppressor, a hidden hand that manipulates all life, shatters the comforting simplicity of the light versus the dark in all of our minds. Kreia challenges the idea that destiny is noble, or that surrendering to cosmic will can ever be called true freedom. In her eyes, the galaxy's endless cycle of war and suffering was evidence of a moral failing, but proof that the Force is a prison, one masquerading as enlightenment. Few characters in the franchise ever confront the very foundation of existence with such clarity and with such bitterness. In the end, Kreia's story is both a warning and an invitation. It warns of the dangers of blind faith, whether in tradition, power, or destiny, and it invites every being to question who they are without the Force's influence. Her legacy is the uncomfortable realization that perhaps the most heroic act is not to obey or to conquer, but rather to choose freely, even in the defiance of the universe itself. This is what makes Kreia unforgettable. She is a philosopher and a heretic, a mentor and a destroyer. And above all, Kreia is a reminder that true strength is born in the struggle to create one's own purpose. And with that, my friends, thank you so much for joining us in the archives here today, and may the Force be with you.